Ben, I'm so stoked to have you here. Ben and I were just laughing because we WhatsApp so much. We've both been friends for, I don't know, almost probably 5 years now, eh, Ben?
Yeah, man.
Yeah, and we were just messaging about surfing as we usually do, and surf skating, and which is like training for surfing. And we were joking about how we haven't actually seen each other's faces in a while, so it's actually a little weird. It's actually a little awkward hopping on for the first moment.
I actually remember the first time we met in person, maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, when I came to Squamish, and you picked me up at the bus stop, and you were like, "Oh my God, you're in 3D," because up until that point we had just been Zooming.
Yeah, it's like we're in different rooms, and I've seen you wearing different shirts, but like, yeah, I don't actually know what the side of your face looks like, or like your back,
different perspective.
Totally, it's funny. Well, I'm stoked to have you here, Ben, because you're somebody who's been through a lot, but you've been able to take those adversities and turn them into positives. I love how you think about the world. You're a very strategic thinker. Ben was in my MensGroup. He's also in an entrepreneur group of mine, and I just love how you talk about things. I love how you summarize things. So I'd love to start with you. Could you give a short intro on yourself, like to maybe just some of the adversities you have faced, what you're up to now, and what you're doing for work and stuff?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for that, Sean, and really happy to be here and to have known you for these last 4 or 5 years has been great. So yeah, I guess a little bit of context for me as a person. I've always had that sort of inquisitive mind, and went to college for mechanical engineering and ended up actually majoring in philosophy, switching after the second year, which people think is a pretty big leap in a different direction. But from my experience, it's actually very similar in that in philosophy, you're really building and constructing thought experiments, and you can actually construct and test things much faster than you can if you have to build things physically. So, but kind of conceptually, I found like they're very similar. So I always had this mind that just wanted to understand how things worked. And that extended from a pretty early age to like the human body, and, to working out and exercising and understanding how the body responds and everything. And then in my mid-20s, I was working as a personal trainer. I also had a surf camp in Eastern Long Island, was traveling the world surfing and competing in some competitions and basically living the dream until I came up against a challenge that all of my previous ways of thinking couldn't really untangle. And as you know, Sean, it ended up being, chronic Lyme, but it took a few years to figure that out, and just lots of health issues, starting with unexplainable fatigue and brain fog. And it just spiraled down pretty quickly from there to the point where I found myself, in bed, really not being able to make sense of my surroundings. I gave a TED talk in which I, shared one experience where I saw my shoes on the floor. This is a true story. And I was just staring at my shoes, like having no idea what they were for. I was like, I know these. It's almost like that sensation of like, oh, I know that word, but I can't think of that word. That's how it was for like run of the mill objects.
Wow, no way.
Yeah, at age 25, 26, it was scary to be experiencing this, and especially because with that kind of thing, as you've been through it as well. There aren't clear answers, and this is where it started. The world started to depart from my previous way of trying to figure things out and thinking, where you could take the thing apart, you could look inside, and there was a clear answer. Okay, this is broken, it needs to be fixed. But when it came to recovering from, what turned out to be chronic Lyme disease, it turned out to be far more complex and nuanced than that. And it wasn't so simple as going to a doctor and saying, okay, this is the cause of these symptoms, this is the medication that will address it, and now you're good to go. It was really, multifaceted and required me to look within myself on many different levels, and ultimately come to the understanding that, well, the tick, which is the cause of Lyme disease, ticks transport these bacteria. While the tick may have been the straw that broke the camel's back might not have broken if it wasn't already carrying this heavy load, right? And so that's what prompted me to kind of take all of that curiosity that I had previously turned toward the outer world of how things work, and really apply that inward and see, how does my mind interface with my body? How do the emotions factor into this? And ultimately, how can I repattern whatever system is going on inside me that has led me to this point into one that's more advantageous for healing and health? And eventually I did figure that out through much trial and error and deviation. And it only really, spawned my curiosity further. After that, I went to work with a company in Midtown Manhattan called Innovative Medicine that was putting on seminars around the world, bringing together doctors from all different disciplines, MDs, NDs, osteopaths, every walk of life. And I was like a sponge taking in all of this, information about what is this thing that we know as the human being, and how can we, navigate the world and our health in a way that makes us lighter, healthier, and improves our experience. And just to wrap up where it's led me now is starting my own company called Reorigin, which is ultimately at the core, it's a neuroplasticity program. That's to say, it's a brain retraining program, or it gives people certain exercises through online courses and videos and things like that they can do to start to really understand their own internal cycles that might be keeping them stuck in anxiety, depression, overwhelm, or even chronic conditions like Lyme or long COVID, like things that I've experienced, and gives them a really systematic and science-based approach, with steps that they can take to untangle that for themselves.
Yeah, I love what you're doing, because I think it's so needed, Ben. And thanks for that really well laid out intro. That's fantastic. That's a great summary of you, as I know you. Yeah, in MensGroup, a lot of guys come in with, feeling depressed, feeling down, facing adversities and challenges that might not be short term. There's guys who are just just have a lack of friends, but there's also guys who are facing some significant challenges similar to what you faced. So I'm really looking forward to getting into those topics of how to keep going when things get tough, the power of perspective, useful tools for navigating your feelings as a man, and then the retraining, Reorigin stuff as well. But quickly, just a quick question, which will deviate from that. So hang in there, guys, if you want to hear the stuff about it, managing adversity and emotions and stuff. But you mentioned something really interesting, which was that total load on your body being one of the biggest things you learned about health, and you wouldn't have gotten sick without that. So I was going to ask you, what's the main thing you pass along to other men about how to stay healthy, about how to feel vibrant and not end up in a situation like you and I did, where we blew ourselves out, essentially?
Yeah. I think probably every person on the planet can identify with this feeling of weight on themselves, weight on their shoulders, burden, whatever it might be from. But it results in a feeling of tension, and it translates into physiologic changes like shorter breathing, as well as muscle tension, and then these things obviously can turn into muscle knots and adhesions, and even structural changes to the spine. So this is a deep dive that we could go down, but there's a lot to go into there. But ultimately, what I continue to learn is that what the process of healing comes down to is the process of removing those layers of discomfort, so that we can feel lighter and feel relaxed and at ease, ultimately in any given situation. That's the goal. If you can do that, then we will have a reduced activation of the threat response, which we'll get into. But as I'm sure guys who are listening to this know, because I've heard you talk about this, Sean, when we have certain past experiences or traumas, and then we have certain stresses in life, what can ultimately happen is like a reactivation of this threat response. In some very subtle and deeply subconscious way, the brain and body feels under attack, and it responds by doing those physiological changes like the ones I mentioned, creating tension in the muscles and the jaw, but also drawing vital resources, vital energy away from necessary functions like digestion, healing, immune system. And so it leaves us open to actually getting infections and becoming ill or more sick from things where otherwise our immune system might have been, had more resources to stave it off.
Yeah. And I point this out because that was the biggest takeaway from me as well on my independent health journey was, wow, if I was taking better care of myself before this, I wouldn't have gotten sick. And that's actually the reason why I think I needed to get sick, was to learn how to take care of myself. And when I say not just taking care of myself, I don't just mean like, giving myself a bubble bath once a week or a massage. I mean, emotionally taking care of myself, mentally taking care of myself, not running myself down to empty mentally at work, or all these different, spiritually taking care of myself.
Yeah, I always like to kind of explain it in this way, that there's really two sides to what's going on. It's never just what is coming at us from the environment or what we're exposed to. If it was, then everyone would necessarily have the same response to the same thing. And we know that even statistically speaking, if a cold virus breezes through a room of 10 people, 3 of them will get sick and symptomatic, while 7 remain totally fine. So there's something else going on here. And that other thing is, how and why the body responds. And that has a lot to do with some of the things that we'll get into, I'm sure, as we continue, which is, these stressors that change our stress response. How safe or unsafe does our subconscious mind feel? How well have we been taking care of ourselves in the past, leading up to this? And as you pointed out, it's not just about doing those things like getting a massage or taking a bath to relax yourself, although those things can definitely help. But it's also kind of getting to the root at why is that tension there in the first place? Why are those adversities there in the first place? And what can I do to not necessarily go back and relive them, but go back and expose and release them ultimately?
That's very well said. I mean, that was the largest, probably the majority of my healing journey was actually going back, like identifying the patterns that I was getting stuck in that were leading me to get run down, and then emotionally investigating, what's going on there, and then having to get that stuff out. And so, I want to talk about how to handle these kinds of adversities, and how to, the mindset behind how to keep going when things get tough, and how positive thinking is bullshit. But I think a good next question would be, okay, well, so you mentioned digging in those feelings and stuff. So like one thing you and I talk a lot about is useful tools for navigating feelings as a man, like seeing feelings as indicators. Could you elaborate on that? How can somebody, start to get into that stuff? Because a lot of us guys have no idea how to. It's scary and foreign.
Yeah, well, you mentioned something key there that will tie into this, but how, positive thinking we could think of as sort of bullshit, right? There's a lot of talk about positive thinking. Everyone tells you need to think more positive. No one really tells you how to do it or what that even really means. The hidden indication there is that negative thinking is bad, right?
Yes.
Like negative thoughts will kill you. You know, don't think negative thoughts. Basically, you'll, whether through physiological means or through law of attraction, you'll pull everything you don't want toward you. And I kind of take a different perspective on that. Thoughts in and of themselves are neutral. They are just things. They are just what the mind does. The same way that the ears hear, the eyes see, the nose smells, the mind thinks. I think where I've experienced the most sense of relief and that sense of ease and lightness in my life, and where I now see it working with hundreds of other people, is when they come to the realization that they don't actually need to pay that much attention to their thoughts. It's not that they're not necessarily telling you something useful, beyond telling you, like, beyond helping you make a to-do list or how to cook an omelet. A lot of it is really just chatter. I kind of think of the mind and that chatter and those thoughts that come from the mind, especially those negative rumination type of thoughts, as like a little squawk box. Imagine you have, a football stadium, and there's this little tiny radio in the corner, and everyone's huddled around the radio because they think that that's where the action is, not realizing that there's this entire freaking stadium and that's where life is, and that's where life's going on. So again, the problem is not necessarily thoughts, positive or negative. It's our over attendance to them that really gets us stuck looping in them. And so, okay, so what do we pay attention to instead? Well, feelings, on the other hand, are your body's sensation. They're much more in the body than in the mind. And I think that a much better proxy for whether we're on track or off track or moving forward or stagnating is our feelings. How comfortable, how relaxed, how at ease do you feel? And realizing that also feelings and emotions our information. I think when we start to view it in this way, we can kind of let ourselves off the hook a little bit of feeling like we have to go back and understand the source and the meaning and drill deeper into every emotion, thought, and reaction that we've ever had. It can be a really daunting task. And I think there are certainly times and places where it's useful to have that kind of understanding, to kind of map out those past patterns and everything. But I think beyond that, it's really useful to realize that these sensations are just biochemicals going on in your body.
Yeah.
That just like when you drink a cup of coffee and you feel a little rush, it's because there's chemicals working their way through your system, and that those chemicals have a half-life. And the reason, I'll give you one example of like why it actually matters to just have this simple awareness, is that simply by becoming aware that the feelings are sensations and chemicals, and that they're not necessarily telling you something super important, can allow you to come back to baseline, can allow them to work their way through their system sooner. So going with the same example of coffee I just gave, like Sean, imagine if all of a sudden your heart started racing and your palms started sweating.
Usually happens when we talk like this, actually. Yeah.
Right. Well,
don't tell Katie.
Right. It can happen, to a lot of people. And like, we don't know where it comes from most of the time. Yeah. And it's that not knowing that triggers the anxiety. That's what triggers the meta level of thinking about the thinking. Now it's like, okay, I'm not just nervous. I'm not just having these palpitations or whatever. I'm nervous about being nervous.
Yes.
Because I don't know where this is coming from, and I don't know what's going to fix it. And that's what leads us into these spirals. And the very act of ruminating on the worry, paradoxically, is what's perpetuating it. So, but if I had told you, Sean, you just drank 2 cups of coffee, in 6 seconds, I think what would happen would be you would still be feeling the increased heart rate, the pupil dilation, like all these things would still be happening in your body, but an important difference would have taken place. You would say to me, oh yeah, you're right. And then in 30 minutes and 60 minutes and 90 minutes, you'd be feeling better and lighter and more at ease, because the chemicals would naturally work their way through your system instead of being artificially recirculated by your own brain.
Yeah, makes sense. So how do guys actually, like, what are the nuts and bolts of actually moment to moment? I mean, you just gave a great example of the difference between the what's happening, the trigger, and then our response to it, which can be natural, a physiological response like caffeine, feeling more energy. And then there's the sort of ruminations and thinking our story we're creating ourselves, which, from a Buddhist perspective would probably be called suffering. How can men actually, nuts and bolts day to day, like start to feel those things, start to be comfortable with these feelings coming up in the moment, when for 30, 40, 50 years, some of these guys, we have MensGroup for 70 years, they've been told and ridiculed around feeling these uncomfortable feelings.
Yeah. So this is where things get hopeful and exciting, because the brain, we know through research in neuroplasticity, is indefatigably plastic. That's to say, it never stops changing at any age. So it doesn't matter how old you are, how many times you've repeated the same patterns. Your brain is no less equipped to change now than it was when you were a child, ultimately. We know that perhaps it's a little bit more plastic when it comes to learning languages and certain skills when you're a kid, but ultimately change is our nature. It's happening all the time. And we can actually, when we tune into it, we can actively direct where that change goes. So in terms of, nuts and bolts, it really comes down to a few key concepts that people need to understand and then practice with repetition to A, get in touch with those feelings, and then B, start to transmute their pattern in a way that works to their advantage. Getting those, like, I think it was Bruce Springsteen who said about going on stage, it's not about getting the butterflies to, be removed. It's not about getting rid of the butterflies. It's getting them to fly in formation. So when it comes to, even feeling negative emotions or what we would call negative emotions, it's not necessarily, at least at first, it's not about getting rid of them. That shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be to reframe them. And there's something we'll get into called cognitive reappraisal that we could use to kind of reclassify them so that it changes our physiology to them and allows us to move forward in the face of them. And when you do that, again, somewhat paradoxically and very Buddhistly, they start to change. So it's like, the Buddhist approach is, the saying is, the rock is only heavy when you push against it. And by not pushing against it, it actually ultimately ceases to exist. So, if you want, we can get into some of the nuts and bolts of like how I would, break down a practice, like what that looks like. But yeah, what would you like to know?
It's like boots on the ground. If I'm a guy and I'm going through a divorce and I'm feeling, I'm feeling uncomfortable with some of the things I have to be going through, courts, moving up on myself or whatever, of course those feelings should be there. And it's like, in the moment, how do you stop the ruminations from getting away from you? How do you stop those, stressing about those feelings?
Yeah. So I think you already kind of raised an important point, which is feelings that are generated from real world events, right? Divorce, stress at work, grief, loved one passing away. These are things that, again, the idea is not to compartmentalize or banish or condemn them. It's not even necessarily to desensitize ourselves from them. The idea is to be able to use this information, but to be able to stay in contact and move forward and do the things that we need to do, whether it's comfort ourselves, take care of ourselves or others, or, move forward with paperwork or legal processes or actually get things done. We need to be present for these. So the basic tenet when it comes to like behavioral psychology is what they call behavioral avoidance and behavioral contact or going towards something. So at any given time, we're always either withdrawing from something or we're moving toward it. And ultimately, we want to be able to stay in contact in any scenario, which is just to say that we want to be able to be comfortable with whatever arises. So how would this look when it comes to dealing with uncomfortable emotions or things that are inherently create agitation? So the first step is really simply about awareness, of course. It's just like being present and feeling what you feel. And even feeling them as sensations in your body, removing the label or the story that comes up like, oh, this emotion is coming up because this reminds me of the time when my dad did this and this. It's like, okay, just pause the story for a moment and just feel the sensations, right? It's like, because again, if you could feel these palpitations and you could make up a story that, oh, I'm nervous because I'm on this podcast or I don't know who I'm talking to or all these things. Or you could realize I just drank 2 cups of coffee and that's why my heart's racing. So similarly, let's take a pause and realize that these are sensations in the body. They're just there. They're not good. They're not bad. They're sensations in the body. And then start to separate yourself a little bit from the sensations, just see them kind of for what they are. One way that's great to do that is through something like visualization or engaging your other senses. So one practical way to do this would be, let's say, you can actually put those feelings or sensations or even the story, if it comes up, on something like a movie screen in your mind, and you could move that screen further and further back. And then you could redirect your focus to where you are right here and right now. So sitting in this chair, being present, you can feel the things in your body that actually feel comfortable and relaxed, and you can help your body to relax. So by doing this, you're already starting to create a new neurological association between that thought, that feeling, or that thing that's causing agitation. And you're now kind of rewiring that with the ability to keep your body calm despite having that memory, that thought, or that feeling, right? So now you're already kind of freeing yourself from it. Now, the next step would be to start to replace that story or that narrative with one that works to your advantage. And this can be as simple as reframing the threat or this thing that's happening, to me that I have to deal with as a challenge, that this is going to be something that may not be comfortable, but it's ultimately going to help me grow. And so it's kind of like a classic fix versus the growth mindset, focusing on the process versus the outcome. and saying that, if the goal of life is actually to grow, to stretch, and to expand, then this challenge is perfect, right? If the goal of life is to be comfortable all the time, not be challenged at all, then of course, kind of like I'm in for a world of hurt because I'm just focusing on the obstacles. But the neuroscience is actually pretty exciting. What's coming out is that simply by changing that narrative, by what's doing this cognitive reappraisal and simply saying, okay, this is a challenge instead of this is a threat, the physiology starts to change. So, you could raise your heart rate by running up a flight of steps, or you could raise your heart rate by having a panic attack. Now, both of those seem similar, but there's actually very important nuanced differences. Whereas when you raise your heart rate through that challenge response because you ran up this flight of steps and you feel good that you did that, stroke volume of the heart changes, blood pressure changes. It actually changes your hormonal profile in a way that moves you toward action. It drives your focus into the present moment and moves you toward where you want to go. If you elevate the heart rate by focusing on something that gives you a panic attack, heart rate is still elevated, but stroke volume is decreased oxygen and nutrients flow throughout the system. Focus takes on this lateral kind of view where we begin to feel overwhelmed instead of focused. And our main action is biased toward running away from what we want to avoid. So if we can stay in that challenge response, we can move toward what we want. If we get stuck in the other one, we're running away from what we want to avoid. And it's a subtle difference at first, but the more you practice this and the more you consciously make that shift, the easier it gets. And eventually it can happen by default.
Yeah, I found that in my own life, and I've seen a lot of guys have success with that in MensGroup is what you said. It's that reframing. Okay, I feel something. You start to let the story starts to get away from you, and then I can catch it and go, no. I'm not actually upset because of that. I'm actually upset because of this. Where's the positive here? Why? How is this a good thing? That's not positive thinking. It's just considering the other side of it. What else could actually be making me feel this way? Also, I noticed in those moments when I feel intense feelings, usually the thoughts that are getting away aren't based in fact at all. So I like to come back to what are the facts about this situation? And really it comes down to the power of perspective, right? Which is something that I've heard you talk about before. Could you share a little bit more about how perspective is just in general in life is influential, but also on these emotional topics?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you kind of set it up perfectly because you alluded to the fact that there is this spectrum of reality and facts, and that when it comes to positive thinking, it's not about groundless positive thinking. This is where I think people have a very finely tuned BS detector, especially in this day and age, as you well should, right? There's a lot of crap out there. And there's this great saying, I think it's Stephen Pressfield in his book, The Art of War? No, The War of Art, right?
I always get that wrong too. I always recommend it The War of Art. And they're like, it's 5,000 pages, man. I'm like, oh, no.
Yeah,
sorry, it's the other one.
Yeah. He says it's one thing to lie to yourself. It's another thing to believe it, right?
Yeah.
Meaning that we can't really do that. And a lot of this stuff around the positive thinking movement and law of attraction does not work because we have that internal BS detector. If you try and, pull one over on yourself and say oh, this is fine, when actually it may not be fine, everything's going to work out, when in this situation, it might not work out according to what you think that means. Instead, the important thing to realize is that we have the ability to take a massive step back. And the brain is taking in roughly 11 million bits of information per second. Out of that 11 million, 9 million are inherently negative. And this is because of our brain's evolved negativity bias, right? If we have memories from the past, the brain is going to selectively reinforce the pathways that are negative because it wants to teach us things or help us remember things that are potentially dangerous. Even if they're not dangerous, keep us away from those. Exactly. Right. Yeah. So it like fires those circuits again to remind us, hey, don't go there, because the last time you did, even if it was when you were 6 years old, it led to this feeling of discomfort or feeling of danger, whether real or perceived. And most of the time it's perceived in this day and age. But because there is this spectrum of like, there's way too much information coming in through the senses than our brains can process. There's a network in the brain called the salience network, and the salience network job is to selectively filter out different bits of information. And again, if left to its own devices, it will filter out the negative parts. So simply by becoming aware of that, it starts to give us our power back. And then by enacting things like those steps I shared before, you can actually start to switch and retrain that negativity bias into something like a positivity bias. So this is not groundless positive thinking. To your point, it's more putting the entire scene up on the wall and saying, okay, I've been focusing here. And in fact, this is like a tiny, tiny segment of the entire bigger picture. And I can just as easily withdraw my attention from the thing that's causing me this feeling of agitation and place it on something that makes me feel better, which is also and equally as true.
It makes you feel more empowered in the moment. Yeah.
Completely.
Which then sets you up in a better place to take action and fix whatever's going on, that's making you feel negative, if there is a fix. Yeah. That's always been my problem with positive thinking, is like that. I saw a great meme on it actually the other day. It was like, for $14.99, you too can let all your friends know that you're struggling. And it was a t-shirt. It was a t-shirt that said "No bad days." And I just thought that was great, because
that's great.
That kind of ungrounded positive thinking, I always see that. And I'm like, you're so out of touch with, you're just trying to sell yourself that you're happy or that your life is good. If you're wearing a t-shirt like that, probably. Because the reality is that in my life, I think probably 70% of the things that I feel are negative day to day, but I'm still groundedly content regardless. So that's a really interesting perspective. I really like that. The grounded positive thinking.
Yeah. And, I can't emphasize enough the importance of kind of losing your mind and coming to your senses when it comes to this stuff. This gets back into feelings as sensations a little bit, but I really think so much of the work we're doing to heal, to move forward, can be simply distilled to allow your body to feel good. Put yourself at ease. Direct your thoughts, other aspects of your life, whatever needs to be shifted in order for you to put your body at ease. Now, that doesn't mean that we should avoid the things that are challenging us, but rather we should see those things as things that are going to help strengthen us to be at ease in a wider breadth of scenarios, right? Like Sean, you and I are both right now on this kick of like expanding our skills around surfing and skateboarding. As, 30 something guys, we've taken up skateboarding more seriously.
Yeah, well, you have to, we're trending into middle age, so we got to hold on to it somehow. So we're like, okay, we're going to be cool skateboard guys or whatever.
Totally. Right. And so if we want to like expand our skills and get better, ultimately the goal is to you want to be relaxed, because if you're all stiff, it's not going to go well, or it's not going to look good. But we also you also want to try new things and try that turn a little bit faster, a little bit more radically, a little more steeper, put a little more power into it. And then each time you do it and stay aware and try and stay relaxed, eventually, it becomes networked in, it becomes kind of hardwired in, and we're able to find ourselves in more critical situations, whether in the skate park ramp or on the critical part of the wave, and be at ease in those situations.
Mm-hmm. Sports is such a great analogy for me with this, because I've noticed in sports, and I've always been like this, and I think it's because I grew up in a sports family. If I wipe out in a wave, even if I take a beating after, because there's 5 big waves behind it or 10 big waves behind it, I mean, maybe if I'm exhausted, and of course fatigue plays a big part in how your perception of things, but maybe if I'm exhausted, I'll be like, fucking idiot, stupid, and start kicking myself around. But typically my response is oh, what happened there? Okay, this sucks. But what happened there? Okay, my nose dug in. Okay, well, next time I need to lean back a little bit more. I should arch my back. And then sure enough, I turn it into something that's useful. And I noticed that with sports, I do that automatically, but then with other parts of my life, like work and relationships, I was not. So it is interesting how it can show up differently in different parts of your life as well.
Yeah, that's actually a perfect analogy. And do you know what the difference is between what's helping you, why you're able to do that in sports and sometimes not in other areas?
I would assume that's just because of, I must have just adopted that when I was young, that framework, that perspective, that hardwiring. But I'd love to hear what you have to think.
Yeah, I think it's just habit. It's just habit. And the philosopher's stone is curiosity. That when you're learning a new skill or when you're trying to get better at surfing or something, there's this just curiosity to see, okay, what happens if I angled the board this way? Oh, that didn't work, And this, when we move forward with that curiosity, it also helps us to let ourselves off the hook that it wasn't like a fatal error, right? It was actually a learning experience. And yet when we get into other areas of life, work, relationships, these mistakes just seem much more final, right, than they actually are. We have a harder time kind of observing ourselves with that same loving curiosity and saying, oh, that didn't work. Let's try it again this way and see how that works out.
Yeah, it's much more all-consuming and fatalistic, apocalyptic maybe. It's just like, oh no, this happened and now this is not good and I'm not good. And
yeah. And I have a theory as to why that is, or why it's so much easier to have that kind of slightly removed, curious observer mindset when it comes to physical activities and sports and stuff, than it is when dealing with like just more cognitively demanding or emotionally demanding situations. And my theory is that, again, it goes back to the brain taking in all of this information. A massive amount of that information comes in through the senses, through the eyes in particular, the visual field, but also through the skin, through changes in temperature, through what we feel. When you're surfing, you don't really have to think too much, like when you're paddling through the water, right? Like, in fact, there's not even that much room for thinking because the feelings, the amount of sensory data that your body is getting from the water temperature, the texture, the tossing and turning, the vestibular system, your body's equilibrium in space, changing angles, changing terrain, like all of this stuff is just fully consuming in the best possible way. There's no room for that meta level self-analysis where we drag ourselves over the coals. Maybe that comes afterwards, right? That comes on the drive home when you're like, oh, why did I miss that wave? Right?
Let the one that got away. Every session there's one of those.
Yeah. But when you're out there, man, like you're in it, right? You are fucking in it. And especially when you're riding a wave, like that is the biggest source or one of the biggest sources of the flow state, because you're just fully in it. So there are ways that we can take what we learn from physical activities that involve full immersion in our environment, and we can import those gems of wisdom into our emotional lives, into our work lives, into our relationship lives. And the way that we do that is by, when we catch ourselves that this is what we're doing, what we're judging ourselves, coming up with these stories or clamping down, creating that tension, we return to our senses. The same way you do when you're surfing. You actually just come down to refocusing your attention to what do I feel? What do I see? What do I touch? What do I taste? Like anything that's going on in that physical space. How cool does the light look? How green is that tree outside my window? Okay, now I'm in this environment as a human being instead of just as a brain that's overly thinking and overly processing a minute amount of information.
Yeah, I think that's great because you're 100% right. Like I've had the opportunity to surf with people or do sports with people where they're new to it, and they're just getting so upset about wiping out. They're giving themselves such a hard time. Stupid. And it's just so interesting that in other parts of their life they're not like that, but then all of a sudden in sports it shows up. So I think it really is habit. It really is habit. You're right. Yeah. And the mind is a wonderful thing, but it's not the best tool for every job. It's the best tool for Excel spreadsheets and financial modeling and stuff like that. But when it comes to
navigating these much more, nuanced areas of life, we really have to approach it like a whole human being and realize that our body, our sensory system, is a finely tuned instrument. And if we only use our minds, we're really cutting ourselves off from the 95% of this magnificent instrument that we have.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And that is the instrument that I've found from my, health journey and all the adversities I've been through that really makes a difference as to whether I'm actually enjoying my life day to day or not. Like Tony Robbins, who I don't really follow, but he says the real determinant of whether your success is like how much of your life do you actually enjoy. And for me, that's 100% mindset, perspective. All the great mentors that I look up to, John DeMartini and all these guys, they talk about perspective. That seems to be the common theme throughout all of it.
Yeah. This is something you and I have talked about like a fair bit, because it's, man, like even knowing this stuff intellectually, I still get caught, right? I still realize, oh man, a few weeks have gone by and I haven't really prioritized doing those fun things or even going surfing, like those things that I know get me out of my head and make me feel good.
Yeah, we talked about that last week. I was like, go surf, man. Fuck.
Yeah, and I did. and game changer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually still on that upward spiral. So it's awesome. But those are like the little things that are simple. We just don't necessarily always give them the importance that they deserve, because we don't think that it's connected to the experience that we're having or the challenge we're facing. When in reality, like if you just do those simple things that elevate your mood, that immerse you in the environment, that get you in that flow state, on a fairly regular basis, that's also where I've found the most dramatic improvements in my mental and physical health.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I couldn't agree more. One thing I'd like to bounce off you quickly on this topic is a guy who I've been studying lately is John DeMartini, and his whole DeMartini method is basically the universe is balanced, and so we get caught up creating these fantasies, like overly positive thoughts about things, and then also tragedies, like getting super negative about wiping out your surfboard or whatever, when in reality, the world and our experience, there's an equal positive and negative in everything, and it's just up to you what you choose to focus on. And he says even people dying, even, these things that are terrible, divorces, it's like you may not even know what those positives are yet, but they're there. There's no, because the world is balanced, the universe is balanced, and Mother Nature seems to present things in that way. What do you think about that?
I would take it actually one step further. This is something I've given a lot of thought to, over many, many years. And where the issue comes in a little bit for me is even in the value judgment of saying that these events or thoughts are positive or negative. I think there's a way that we can further disentangle ourselves from them while still remaining present to them, compassionate, empathic wherever need be. But I think the goal, the place that we want to get to, as I understand it, is that we don't get swayed so heavily by these ebbs and flows of life, right? Mm-hmm. And surfing is the perfect analogy here, because the waves there's peaks and there's valleys, there's peaks and troughs, and we can get tossed and turned and flipped off our boards and everything. Or you can just ride it out, experience that, how fun it is, or you can take it to even the next step and you can actually learn how to surf these kind of waves of fluctuation and uncertainty. For me, the analogy that comes to mind or the visual that comes to mind when thinking about, what you just said, these events and stories and interpretations of things that go on in life and things that actually may be going on in life, and how we can begin to sort of stay fully present to them while not being swayed or carried along with them, is I think of them as a pendulum. And this goes back to like Hermetic philosophy and everything, where they talk about the dual nature of everything. Everything has a positive, everything has a negative. One short sidetrack I'll take is that, an analogy I've heard before, which kind of makes sense, is that when you pick up a stick, there's two ends of the stick. So like here I've got a pen, right? There's this end, you could label this as positive and this is negative. So when you pick up a stick, you pick up the entire thing. You don't just pick up the positive side. You pick up the entire spectrum. Similarly, you could apply this to getting involved with a person. When you have a relationship with someone, you let that person into your life. You don't just let the positives in or just the negatives, right? You're taking on and taking up the whole thing. What is in our control is where to adjust that focus, right? It's like, again, it's not groundless positive thinking or saying that this person is something that they're not or has something that they don't. It's choosing to focus on the things that lead to better results, that make us feel better and that make them an improved person. So choosing to focus on those positive things. So I do agree with that, like exercising our freedom to choose where our focus goes and choosing the more positive aspects wherever possible. But the analogy I was starting to make before is there's another way to see this as well, which I think is an important layer, which is, imagine a pendulum for a moment, right? So the pendulum swings back and forth and it has this string that it's attached to. So if we really latch on to the events in life as like being the determinants of how we feel and function, we will just be helplessly pulled along by the ebb and flow of that pendulum. There's another option though, right? A couple of other options. One, we can try and use force to stop that thing from swinging or to mitigate it. I want it to stay on this side and not swing back to the other side, right? We can use all this might to like keep it on one side, which never really works out for too long.
No.
Eventually we tire out and it swings all the way back in the other direction, probably further.
Yeah.
The other option is that we can climb the rope. We can climb that string of the pendulum and ideally even make it somewhere toward the top. And the higher you go, the less subject you are to the swings of the pendulum. They're still happening, even violent swings, right? They could still be fully swinging back and forth, but now being somewhere toward the top of that rope, you're really just kind of moving a little bit. You're looking down, noticing that this is going on, but you're not totally drawn in by it. Does that make sense?
You're just kind of observing it. You still feel the swing of, the event, but you're not being completely consumed by the movement of it.
Yeah. You can observe it and yourself with compassion and even humor.
That's great. One other framework that I've been using lately that I'd love to bounce off you, just to throw this in the ring with everything else we're talking about, which is really how to face tough times and how to think about adversity, which is the topic we're going to get into next. A wise friend of mine once said in one of our men's groups, okay, so let's say something bad happens, Sean. Like universally accepted as not a great experience. Okay, a loved one dies, right? That's not a great experience. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to feel terrible. You're going to miss them. In the short term, it'll look like there's zero positive that comes from that. But in your life, have you had experiences where you thought something was bad and then all of a sudden it turned to good? Or you thought something was good and then it all of a sudden turned into a really bad situation? Getting excited about a new living situation, then realizing there's a train a block away that keeps you up at night or whatever, And at what point can you definitively say that an event was bad or good? Is it 2 hours? Is it a day? Is it a week? Is it a month? Because I've had situations that are terrible, like our health situations. You and I had a similar journey there that turned out to be one of the best things that's ever happened to me. I've heard stories in men's group of people where their partner dies. That's horrible, but then that's the catalyst they needed to break loose and then get into their stuff and then find their dream career and all these kinds of things. So I also, whenever I feel emotional about things, I always think about what's bad, what's good, when can an event be determined as bad or good? And the answer is, if you can't place it on a timeline, then it doesn't exist. There is no bad or good. It's just, we'll see. And I'm going to choose the positive aspects of it because it's going to make me feel better and because it's going to help me get to where I want to go. That's it.
Yeah. I mean, I think you answered it beautifully yourself. It really comes down to context, right? And to kind of having that overview, and understanding that events in and of themselves are not necessarily or are not inherently good or bad. There are things that can make us feel better or feel worse. Ultimately, in my experience, I haven't come up against anything that I couldn't at some point later down the road recontextualize as a gain in experience, even if it was a loss of a loved one. We
have a guy who was in our men's group who lost his 2-year-old daughter on a trip. They were on a vacation. They were standing doing this tourist thing. It was him on the outside, his wife on the outside. It was one daughter in the middle, and there's 2 other children on the outsides, and a rock fell and took out the one child in the middle. And he now says it's the best thing that ever happened to them. Obviously, he misses that child very much, but I agree. There's no event that can't. Yeah. Just to give you an extreme example.
That's a radical example, but it also really speaks to that fact that that's I'm sure a person who's done a lot of work. I think I know who it is you're talking about, and who's really tapped in and kind of tuned in. But it does go to show that even the most challenging of losses can be recontextualized in some way as a gain in experience or wisdom or love or compassion or ability to be compassionate toward others. I'll just give a personal example of times when I think I really fucked up, right? Or even keep repeating the same mistakes or patterns or things like that. In a longer timeline, I've learned that I can look at those things and realize that they really make me human. And now when I see other people doing similar things, of course I have such deep compassion for them because I've been there and I'm still there I'm still on that journey with many things. We all are. I don't think we're ever quite done in this lifetime. So I think ultimately it comes down to being more comfortable, compassionate, and feeling like embracing the works in progress that we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. That's a great way to summarize that. And really, I mean, everything that we're talking about here is how to navigate adversity in a healthy way and a way that's going to lead you to getting through that quicker and with less suffering. And ultimately how to, keep going when things get tough. So like you're somebody who was like a high achieving person living the dream, and all of a sudden you're bedridden, can't even use your legs, don't even understand what shoes are. Great. Just for anybody who's listening, Ben has a great TED Talk on that experience. You've also been through a lot of other adversities, which I'll let you bring up. I won't bring them up because some of them might be private. But what advice do you have for getting through a difficult time, especially like a longer difficult time where you're not going to be feeling any different tomorrow?
Yeah, I would say one thing is to look back on yourself from the future. This is something that's helped me a lot, and it's cool. Become a sort of popular question of like, what would you say to your 20-year-old self, your 15-year-old self, whatever it might be, when you were a child. And invariably, if you kind of play that exercise out at any age in your life, you realize that the answer is always something like, don't stress about it. You're doing great.
Right. Totally.
It's like some form of that.
Every time.
So one exercise I found to be incredibly useful is to actually go into the future, to kind of disidentify or dissociate from yourself in the present, go into that future version of yourself. Maybe like, okay, what would 80-year-old Sean say looking back, and like become that person, look back at yourself now. And, invariably it's going to be some form of like, you're doing great, buddy. You're doing great. Don't stress.
It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
It's not a big deal, man. You're doing fine. It's not a big
deal, man. Yeah. I think I shared this meme with you the other day that I think I saw it on Joe Rogan podcast, but it was just so great, where there's this picture of the galaxy, right? It's like the Milky Way galaxy and all of its glory and beauty and like amazing starburst patterns and stuff. And then there's this arrow pointing to this little speck on the outer rim of the galaxy. And it says, "You are here, crying in your shower before work."
Yeah, totally. I remember that one. I thought that was so great.
Yeah.
That's it. Zoom out.
So it's, zoom out, keep things in context, look at yourself from a distance with love and with humor, and know that we're all in it together, man. We're all fighting the good fight, and
everybody's fighting the same things. If I've learned anything from Men's Group, it's like everybody. It doesn't matter if you're a professional athlete. We got guys who are athletes. We got guys who are celebrities. We got guys who are high-powered investment bankers, lawyers, doctors. They're all just dealing with the same things. There's no new problems. It's all interpersonal or like subtle addictions, or like, I don't know, communicating emotions, communicating better with people,
Yeah. And the other thing is again, going back to, kind of where we started, which is not to take those inner judgments and thoughts and stories too seriously. To realize that they're coming from past programming. Doesn't matter where they're coming from. I don't believe that it's necessary, at least it can be interesting, but not necessary to go back and really untangle, do psychoanalysis to really untangle and fully understand those things. We can still make headway simply by realizing them for what they are, which is just old patterns, just old habits ingrained in the nervous system. And everyone has them. You can view them as, your 6-year-old self, or you can view them as your past self. And I'll give you another exercise that I like to use. This is one
please.
that you can do with a partner, and it can be with a romantic partner, but it can, I'm sure, just as easily be applied to a business partner or any other relationship. Is whenever there's conflict, when you get quiet with yourself, you take that step back, you find that you can kind of dislodge yourself from it. See yourself with that person as your 4 or 5 or 6-year-old self sitting in a sandbox, right? Just fighting over like it's mine, it's not mine, it's not yours, it's mine kind of thing. Like just having that argument, because ultimately when we experience that, those disparate feelings and that sense of conflict against one another, whether it's just an argument with a spouse or whether it's going to war with a nation, it's coming from that place of being freaking 5 years old and fighting over the thing in the sandbox. It really is that. Yeah.
Yeah,
and when you can just kind of like, when you can strip down the big person and the identity that we've built up for ourselves and just see that little innocent child, you can kind of smile at it and be like, oh boy, you've got so much to learn. Both of you.
Totally. Yeah. A friend of mine actually got a tattoo of him, a really wise friend of mine who like sold his businesses and went back to school and studied philosophy and psychology, and he ended up getting this tattoo on his arm, which was like a guy's face, and it was half monkey and half man. And he said, basically, I was like, why would you get that? Because it's not really a good looking tattoo. And he's like, because man, like if I've learned anything from, going back and studying psychology and philosophy, it's that we're just monkeys flailing away against ourselves. We got this monkey brain, we got this, evolved human brain, but the monkey brain's still chirping away and firing all these emotions. And it's just like exactly what you said. We're just those little kids still at the end of the day that have a lot of emotions and not a lot of control over them.
Yeah, totally. And always, what catalyzes those emotions, what brings them to the surface is adversity. So, going back to your question about how do you deal with adversity, in short, float through it, right? Adversity isn't the problem. It's our resistance to the adversity that causes the problem. That's what creates the tension we've been talking about, the physiologic changes, and even ultimately changes to the nature of our health, immune system, and things that can happen down the road as a result of that. So it really ultimately comes down to, man, it sounds so cheesy and simple, but it's being pleasant in the present. It's being aware, alerted to and present to the things, the circumstances that are going on in our lives, but being able to kind of step back from them and not get sucked into them.
Yeah, totally. And one thing that you've helped me with, and when I've been upset in men's groups or just when I've reached out to you personally on the health journey or whatever, is like, there's this great Dane Cook. He's a comedian bit where he gets his son for the first time. He's got a young son, and he's having like the first time he gets him by himself because he's a single parent, and he's all excited to cook for him. And I guess he doesn't cook the chicken well enough, and so his kid gets food poisoning. His kid ends up on the bottom, and he's throwing up and all sorts of other stuff. And he looks up his dad all upset, and he's like, "Well, I guess this is me now." And he actually thought that like this experience that he's having is going to last forever. Like this is him now. And I find that myself whenever I run into adversity, that's exactly what I feel like. I'm like, this is never going to change. It's going to be this way forever. When in reality, and the thing that I fall back on that you've reminded me is it's like weather or waves in the ocean. It's like, clouds roll in, clouds will roll out.
Yeah. I saw this quote that said, the secret to happiness is accepting what is and making the most of every day. So it's like those two things at the same time, right? Accepting what is going on right now, and then exercising your freedom to choose what you can do in the moment, whether it's, and it could be as simple as go for a surf, or, go for a walk, or watch a funny movie, or do something to, bring you back into that state of just immersion and appreciation, and just, into the senses.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'd love to hear about what you're doing with Reorigin, because I think the retraining stuff is awesome. A lot of guys aren't familiar with what that is, that's even a thing that you can do. So give us the layman's explanation of what you guys are doing and how it can help guys that are in MensGroup.
Yeah. So, Reorigin is like I mentioned, it's a program that helps people through a series of online videos and coaching to retrain these patterns in the brain that may have been ingrained throughout our lifetimes that lead to things like anxiety, burnout, depression, but can also be contributing underlying wiring or mechanisms to conditions like I experienced and you experienced, like Lyme disease, like long COVID, like chronic fatigue syndrome, like any inflammatory condition or any chronic condition that has an inflammatory component, which is basically every condition
everything
on the planet these days. Inflammation is something that's essential for acute injuries. If you get hit your knee or something, you want to have inflammation, rush to the site to address the injury. But as human beings, we're extremely unique creatures on this planet, that we have the capacity to ruminate, to agonize about things. Whereas animals, take the hit, their body responds with the white blood cells, inflammation happens, and then it returns to baseline and they're good to go. But as humans, it's actually possible to, take a hit on the knee, to worry about it, to ruminate about it, or to stress about other things in life at the same time. And for that to create a cycle in the body whereby the body is essentially learning, and the brain and body learn to continuously produce that same stress response and continuously produce inflammation. And that inflammation has a host of deleterious effects to the system, like suppressed immune system, just misinformed resource allocation, taking those resources away from healing and digestion and recovery and placing them on perpetuating more inflammation, things like that. So the challenging part for people is that these are deeply subconscious cycles. They're beyond subconscious. They are ingrained in regions of the brain, of the limbic system and the nervous system. But the key is that it is possible to bring them to the light of conscious awareness and to intervene and start to repattern them. So for anyone who's been experiencing something like, an old injury that should have gotten better, but it hasn't, maybe they had that knee injury like 6 months ago and structurally the knee is healed, but they still have pain there. This would be like chronic pain syndrome, or someone who's still feeling fatigued even after the COVID has passed. The reason more and more research is now showing is that the body and the brain essentially learn to continue to overprotect you by amping up those pain signals and those inflammatory responses. And the good part is that, and what we're doing at Reorigin, is that the same way that your brain and body can learn to do these things, it can also unlearn to do these things. And you can retrain it through some relatively simple brain training exercises to allow your brain and body to settle back to baseline and to reestablish that self-healing. I always like to try and explain to people that the body is way too complex for us to heal. People are always curious about this sort of mind-body connection and how does your brain or your thoughts heal your body? And it's actually nothing like that. We don't have the ability for our brains, or we don't have that. It's like naive to think that you with your own little thoughts could heal your own body. Instead, what's going on is that the body has all of the faculties and ingredients to heal. The same way that if you look at a seashell or the leaf on a tree, it has all of the information embedded within the atomic structure of that thing to create that elaborate pattern. The body has some 3 trillion reactions that take place per second, way more than we can consciously govern, right? The organs, the liver, the kidneys, the lymphatic system, these systems function just fine without your intervention most of the time. It's only when they get taken off course that we have to kind of bring our conscious mind back in to simply reestablish the brain as that CEO of the system that can govern over all the organs to make sure that they're doing their job. So again, it's not about us having to micromanage our system. It's more about reestablishing self-management to the system.
Yeah, I love that. And so like, I've had experiences with learned pain. This is a new concept to me, but when I got better from my Lyme disease journey, I still had like this lingering symptoms in the back of my head. And I do have something that's going on there, but like a friend of mine who's in the medical industry pointed out, hey, have you heard about learned pain? Like sometimes you can just take on pain or whatever. And so I talked to you about it and I did some exercises and that pain just kind of went away. And I was like, whoa. How long was I carrying that around? How long was that? Like maybe a year and a half, 2 years, so it's a very real thing. Yeah, it's a very real thing.
Yeah. It's there's tons of science behind it. And a great example of that is, well, like you mentioned, when you have something that's very real pain, the pain sensations are real, and they can feel like structural damage. I remember I had, low back pain one summer that was just relentless for 3 months. And I was sure that there was, I was just visualizing in my mind the discs rubbing together and squishing all this stuff. And I went to the doctor, and when I learned that it was actually nothing like that, the pain actually went away. So it caused me to sort of look at this in a different way. But a great example that's pointed to in a lot of scientific literature is phantom pain, right? For missing limbs, because it's obviously a form of learned pain or miscommunication between the brain and those pain sensing neurons. So the same way, again, that the brain can learn that there's pain there, it can also be retrained to realize that actually there's nothing wrong with that area, and it doesn't need to take those pain signals. So this is something that anyone can actually do themselves. And it's been exciting to create a program that kind of walks people through a simple series of steps that they can apply to things like chronic pain, chronic fatigue, adrenal fatigue, post-COVID, even Lyme disease, and start to see results, fairly quickly.
Yeah, how about for just general fatigue and general inflammation stuff? Because a lot of guys come into MensGroup, they got a lot of stress on their plate. They like have, they're going through divorces or whatever. And, they're dealing with, they're not feeling the usual selves. They're just feeling dragged down. They might not fit a check box like Lyme disease or chronic fatigue or whatever, but like, could what you're doing help those guys as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we see a lot of people with just this sort of general background level of anxiety or burnout, you could call it, right? This kind of feeling of overwhelm. And a lot of the work we're doing is again, it's not about micromanaging or manipulating the body, because the body is so finely tuned. It's far beyond anything that we're capable of really managing in that way. But when you reestablish your brain as the chief organizer, it's kind of like it's like putting an automatic transmission into your car, right? Going at a certain steady pace, like, works fine if life isn't on an even keel. But life requires us to go beyond baseline, right? Like, it requires us to go uphill and downhill and over bumps and everything. And that's where you need to be able to change gears, to be able to deal with the challenges that life brings your way, but downshift in a way where it's like, okay, I don't have to over rev the engine. I can still be present to this. I can accomplish this. I can get through this. And I can do it in a calm way where my body is supported and actually getting healthier. So this is something we see a lot, especially in this day and age, because people are overwhelmed. There's a lot of information, work is complicated. We're on all these messaging apps. There's all this stuff to check and to attend to. And so it really comes down to the fact that we have never been trained to be in this kind of environment. Last point to this, I'll just kind of make an analogy that I think people can understand is, think of for a while, I got really into motorcycle racing. I actually went to a MotoGP school.
No way. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
that's funny.
Yeah, I did.
Huh.
Thunderbolt Speedway in New Jersey. It was freaking cool.
Awesome.
And I did it for two reasons. One, I always loved motorcycles. I used to ride, and I stopped when I was ill and wanted to get back into it. And I thought, okay, this is either one of two things is going to happen. Either it's going to make me a better rider, and feel safer on the road, or it will kind of get me to the point where this is not for me, or I decide that this is not a risk worth taking. Ultimately, I decided the latter, because when you're on a motorcycle, especially racing, very small mistakes have very big consequences.
Yes, correct.
And, being someone that's dealt with illness and injuries, I realize for me right now, it's just not a priority or something I want. But the other reason I did it was to deliberately practice being able to be calm in very uncomfortable situations. And there's, few situations where you get to go 200 miles an hour around a track with your head only, a few feet or inches from the track. And you have to be calm. Like, it really requires that calm focus. In GP school, they say the fastest guys have the slowest hands. So
really,
the point I'm getting at is that it is possible to be whizzing around a racetrack of motorcycle life or regular life at 200 miles an hour, and inside yourself and your helmet, it is possible to be at the same time extremely calm and steady. And so, you can have people cutting you off and things happening and accidents forming in front of you and you having to navigate around them, and still be able to, if you've cultivated this internal automatic transmission, so to speak, this internal sense of ability to shift gears appropriately, then it is very possible to be at ease and even be getting stronger and gaining strength as you're going through what could be seen from the outside as adversity.
I love that. That's such a great analogy. You're good with the analogies, man.
Thanks, dude. Yeah. I think about a lot of these things. So,
well, I think this will be really helpful for the guys, because adversity is just something it seems like the guys can't talk about enough. And I love the way you think about this stuff, and I hope you'll come back and chat with us again one day.
Yeah, would love to, man. And, last thing I'll leave you with is just when you start to practice this stuff, right? Because it's not an intellectual exercise. Understanding might be the first step, but we have to really ingrain it and entrain it. When you start to practice this, it is amazing how quickly your perspective changes, and how when things come up in your life, it sounds kind of hokey to say, but this little part of your brain actually becomes almost excited at this new opportunity to keep practicing this calm in uncomfortable situations, right? It's like, this from surfing, or anyone who's embarked on an athletic endeavor or physical skill. It's like, at first you take off on these little waves and it's kind of scary, and then the big ones come and it's even scarier. But after just a few takeoffs, it's amazing how different the terrain looks to you. At first you can't really make sense of it. It's just chaos. It's moving water. You can't see what's where. You get tossed. You don't know where you are in the mix of it. But after a few sessions, oh, okay, actually you start to make sense of it, because your brain is recognizing the patterns. Your brain recognizes that when the water moves here, it means that something is coming from out there. When this jacks up here, it means that I should be here. And you start to tune into it and really become part of it and flow with it. And then it feels good. And so I really think that's, yet again, kind of another analogy for life, that sometimes when we're not, or when we've been in the habit of getting out of contact with challenging situations, that's to say avoiding them or engaging in other behaviors that put a buffer between us and the situation, it can just feel chaotic. It can feel like we're getting rocked. But if we do the thing that's maybe at first less comfortable for us to do, which is to stick with it, tune into it, and learn how to surf those waves of uncertainty, we realize that life and adversity and challenge become this amazing, skate park, this amazing playground, this amazing, ground of opportunity for us to go out and try new stuff and fall on our asses and get back up and just feel like we're stretching in extraordinary ways.
Yeah, I love that, man. Well, thank you for sharing that last point. I think that's really important. And man, just love the way you talk about this stuff. Looking forward to more. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, likewise, dude.
Yeah,
you got it, man.
Anybody who's listening, go check out Ben. You can just Google him, and also Reorigin as well. What was the domain Google for Reorigin, Ben? Yeah.
Yep, it's re-origin.com.
There you go. Boom.
Yep, boom.